Government business, order of the day number 1, standing in the name of Mr Yan, the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Amendment Bill 2025, Serial 15. To move...
Minister.
Madam Speaker, I move that the bill be read a second time.
I call the next member to speak in this debate. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Territory Labor Opposition will be opposing this bill. We are seeing a clear and concerning pattern of behaviour from this CLP government, a pattern of cover-ups and cop-outs. We saw them try to cover up the ICAC police leadership mess rather than actually address it. Madam Speaker, when it comes to spouting about consequences and having credibility around responsibility, the CLP in no way, shape or form exhibit the best behaviour. It took the Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, many weeks to consider and considerable pressure to buckle and actually take action, which is what she promised Territorians in August 2024 that she would do, to look at restoring Territorians' confidence in the institution. And that is critical when you're talking about ensuring the safe and livable communities across the Northern Territory. Madam Speaker, we are seeing the CLP systematically shutting down the voices of Territorians and dismantling legislative and regulatory safeguards when it comes to protecting critical environmental, social and cultural values, not to mention our lifestyle that they pretend to care so much about. We are seeing them do this, Madam Speaker, through their dodgy, rushed consultation of the Territory Coordinator Bill, which passed in the late hours, early mornings of Tuesday and Wednesday, Madam Speaker, with many community members with many questions still remaining unanswered about the concerns that they genuinely expressed through 300 plus public consultation and the 550 plus government submissions, Madam Speaker. And many of these concerns completely ignored by the CLP government. Madam Speaker, we continue to see the CLP rip up important bits of legislation that safeguards regulatory processes like the third-party merits review, Madam Speaker. This is an important layer of scrutiny in the assessment of new developments here in the Northern Territory. And this includes a safeguard, Madam Speaker, for traditional owners, landholders and others who have genuine interests in the community impact of a developmental approval.
Yes, take your seat.
Madam Speaker, this is a debate on the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Amendment Bill, Standing Order 35. It's time to get back and talk about this bill.
Well, members are usually given some latitude, but if you could steer back on to the specific topic we're debating, Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to extend the learning opportunity to the member for Berkeley, who has been in this place for over 4 years now, who is now privileged to be in the position of a decision-making role in the CLP Cabinet. Alas, it's not the role he wanted. He wanted the Attorney-General. We know that, Madam Speaker, and he was shafted because he's a threat to the Chief Minister. But when it comes to what is relevant of what I've just contributed, Madam Speaker, fiscal integrity and transparency, highlighting the lack of credibility that the CLP government has already shown in just 7 months of decision-making and power in the Northern Territory, lack of integrity, lack of transparency, and now they are removing this legislation which provides a measure of accountability when it comes to Territory dollars, the coins that belong to Territorians, Madam Speaker, and that, member for Berkeley, is why this is all relevant. So I'm happy for you to learn and understand your job better, 4 years plus in this place, and not understanding your role now as a minister. It's a bit of a shame job. Thank you. It's a bit of a shame job, Madam Speaker. We have seen, Madam Speaker, the CLP dish up a sham lobbyist register, talking about accountability, transparency, openness, something the CLP government promised they would do, and yet they don't, Madam Speaker. And this ridiculous and gammon lobbyist register, Madam Speaker, does not require the Chief Minister or any of her CLP ministers to be open with the community about which private companies, which organisations they are meeting with. And they made a big fuss, a huge song and dance about bringing back the scrutiny committees of the Legislative Assembly. But, Madam Speaker, they pick and choose, the CLP government picks and chooses what they want scrutinised. And if that isn't a sham, I don't know what is, Madam Speaker, when it comes to integrity and accountability.
Take your seat, please, Leader of the Opposition. Member for Nelson, what's your point
Pointing
of order?
order 35, as the Leader of Government Business said, we're talking about the Physical Integrity and Transparency Bill. We are going way off track here. We're dealing with this bill, and that's what the debate should be confined to.
Well, to be frank, I don't think she is. I think in the general, under the general theme of fiscal transparency and integrity, the member is talking about that in general terms, which people are usually allowed a lot of latitude to do. So if you could steer it back eventually to the direct topic, I'll give you time to do that.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate that observation by the member for Nelson, who is now the Deputy Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, another person who may be able to listen and learn when we're talking about accountability and integrity, because the dollars that we spend as the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker, absolutely matter, and Territorians deserve to know what regulates that. What decisions are made and what safeguards, measures and protections do Territorians have that they expect of their government? And we are seeing an erosion of safeguards by the CLP government. We are seeing an erosion of protections by the CLP government dismantled. We're seeing an erosion of regulatory frameworks absolutely obliterated by the CLP government. So that's why it's pertinent in this debate, Madam Speaker. As you understand, you've been in this House the longest out of all of us, Madam Speaker. So you have seen good governance, bad governance and everything in between, I'm sure, Madam Speaker. Of course, I would never speak for you, but the learning of the past is a huge opportunity for the future, and we feel, Madam Speaker, the Labor opposition absolutely feels that the CLP government has gone into this term as the new government in the last 7 months with their eyes and ears closed, but they are driving at the 130 kilometres down the highway and not a care in the world of what is on the road, what bends and what they could possibly hit in the way. Well, I hope you do, Member for Berkeley. I'd be very worried if the Minister of the CLP government was speeding past with the, on the highway of the many kilometres that he travels, but that's another conversation because, Madam Speaker, getting back to the point, we will be talking about the lack of integrity and accountability, and again, the removal of another measure that Territorians have not been privy to. What is the CLP government replacing when they are making this big decision that impacts on the budget, Madam Speaker? What measures of accountability will the CLP Treasurer and the CLP government, under the Chief Minister Leah Finocchiaro's leadership, what safeguards and measures will they instill to reassure Territorians that they are going to spend in a responsible way? And when they start cutting, which we've already seen, we'll wait for the budget to go through and we'll see those dollars in black and white, when they start cutting projects that mean the difference of life and death when it comes to roads and infrastructure improvement and better housing in the Territory, better healthcare, better education, when they start making those cuts because they are going to do that, Madam Speaker, we know that, that's what the CLP do, that's in the DNA. When they start doing those cuts, what other mechanism is the Treasurer providing to Territorians that they can have reassurance that the CLP government is doing the best job that they can for the Northern Territory? Yes, we wish it was accountability, Member for Brennan, but unfortunately I don't think that we're going to get that. So, Madam Speaker, coming back to the point, the Legislative Scrutiny Committee was another area of accountability and a measure, but then the CLP government pick and choose what they are going to consider for scrutiny themselves. That doesn't sound like a democracy, Madam Speaker. That sounds like a dictatorship. They've got 17 members of Parliament, Madam Speaker. What are they afraid of? They have 3 members of a 5-member committee Madam Speaker, what are they afraid of? And we've just seen, Madam Speaker, in the Territory Coordinator Bill that was passed this year.
Okay, order.
This week, actually, sorry. Geez, it feels like a year already. This week, Madam Speaker, we have already seen that the CLP government doesn't even adopt the recommendation that their own government-dominated committee proposed and signed off on and presented to Parliament and presented to their own government. So when we talk about accountability, integrity, Madam Speaker, and transparency, they have no credibility so far in the 7 months of governing the Northern Territory. I've obviously hit a chord, Madam Speaker, because I hear the Attorney-General piping up to defend this lack of scrutiny, this lack of integrity, this lack of accountability. So obviously, when people start getting rattled and wanting to defend their bad history, you know you've hit a chord and it must be true. Madam Speaker, we have seen smoke and mirrors and absolutely no substance from the CLP government, terrified of scrutiny, which is why this next step of the bill that is before the House, brought before the House by the Treasurer, the bill that the Territory can't afford, that the avoidance of accountability rather than moving the Territory forward is what they're most frightened about. Madam Speaker, the appearance of doing things and trying to be busy, dodging scrutiny, covering things up, hiding, is not the future vision of the economy that Territorians want to see. We haven't seen much more of the CLP's legislative agenda other than the erosion of transparency and accountability, which this bill provides. Again, another clear examples to Territorians, Madam Speaker, of what the CLP is afraid of: transparency and accountability. Madam Speaker, those opposite in the CLP government promised the three-pronged slogan that looks increasingly flimsy to many people, particularly to us, but to Territorians that we speak to every day, Madam Speaker. They promise community safety, yet their bail laws do little to prevent or reduce crime, which the Chief Minister promised. They promise to restore economy, yet their only plan for the economic growth, Madam Speaker, seems to be to take credit for projects that got underway well beyond and years before they came to government under the former Labor government, and now seeking to remove the debt ceiling and not replacing any form of public accountability mechanism in its place. Madam Speaker, the CLP promised to protect the Territory lifestyle, yet they are busy stripping back all sorts of environmental, social and cultural protections that are integral to sustaining our pristine natural resources, which underpin our way of life here in the Territory. Madam Speaker, 7 months into the CLP government, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for the CLP to maintain the illusion that they are actually doing anything to improve the lives of Territorians. And the CLP government's shallowness, Madam Speaker, has become clearer and clearer every day, particularly this week, because those empty promises that they have made now of transparency and accountability are exposed more and more. And no doubt, Madam Speaker, those opposite have had the plan to win the election, but now they're in the election, now they won the election and they're in government, they don't even have a plan to govern. We might see one come out maybe next week, like we asked about the corrections plan, and the corrections minister, the Deputy Chief Minister, Gerard Maley, the member for Nelson, said, oh, we don't have a plan. And then next week he had a plan. He had a plan and a document to share with the Parliament. So we expect the same. Let's get a governance plan for the CLP, Madam Speaker. Maybe they'll present that to Parliament next week. And in fact, Madam Speaker, they're just a very few examples, rather large ones in fact, but very few examples of how the CLP government is working overtime to remove transparency and accountability measures, and conveniently doing it before their very first budget, which will be announced at the next sittings in May. Their quest to become less answerable to Territorians for their actions is becoming a reality. So, Madam Speaker, we come to the details of this particular legislation. We've all seen the Treasurer wringing his hands and feigning shock over the Territory budget, even though year in year everything is published in black and white. So you obviously didn't read anything in the last 4 years in opposition. That's a big shame for not doing your job properly either. Anyway, Madam Speaker, it sounds like the Treasurer, Bill Yan, has never scrutinised the budget paper. So I really feel for the amazing staff in Treasury of having to start from scratch and provide a 101 of how to read a budget to the Treasurer just months before the very first CLP budget will be announced. And Madam Speaker, it's worth a bit of a lesson at the moment. We go back to probably not a great time in the history of this place, Madam Speaker, and again, I don't want to speak for you, but I know you're around in these days with the CLP Giles government, when the now current Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, was part of the Adam Giles CLP team, and the huge decision that the CLP government made at the time, Madam Speaker, to sell off and to lease a number of significant public assets in the CLP government's legacy, not in a good legacy, Madam Speaker. And of course, the two large and very impactful decisions that they made at the time, and the Chief Minister was a part of the team that made this decision, was selling TIO, a public asset, the Territory Insurance Office, and leasing the Port of Darwin, and not even having the ability, grace, credibility, guts to tell the federal government what they did. And that, of course, Madam Speaker, happened when the CLP was last in government. So let's all brace ourselves of what they are scrounging around to look at public assets and what they can sell to make a quick buck here in the Territory, particularly ahead of their first budget in May. Now, Madam Speaker, the Treasurer has the gall to turn around and try and gaslight Territorians, and somehow weirdly thought it was clever or politically strategic to point the finger at the federal Labor government. For the CLP government at the time, Adam Giles as the Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro as part of that team, now the current Chief Minister, for leasing the Darwin port to a Chinese company. And it was on the news, Madam Speaker, pointing the finger and blaming the federal Labor government when it was the NT-CLP government under Adam Giles. Must to think that he can reinvent history and tell lies to Territorians, and it's just laughable, Madam Speaker. Territorians have not forgotten and they will not forget. And the community will not have any of that mistruth, Madam Speaker. They have long memories, and those who are responsible for that deeply incompetent and irresponsible move from a Territory government should absolutely stand up and take responsibility for that, including the Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro. Madam Speaker, despite the CLP's fire sale of the Territory assets, the last Labor government inherited a $900 million deficit and growing debt. The former government worked hard to try and reverse this situation, but was dealt the double whammy of a $2 billion cut in GST by the federal funding, by the feds, and at that time, Madam Speaker, it was a federal Liberal government under the leadership of former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and then the triple whammy of being followed by the significant social and economic challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, which will never be calculated of just how much impact that not just the Territory, but the rest of the country and the world experienced because of the global pandemic. Madam Speaker, we saw the new Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, who was the opposition leader at the time of COVID, was arguing and publicly stating on the radio, in the news, that the Territory's share of COVID vaccinations should be sent down south. And, Madam Speaker, it was our job as the former Labor government to protect Territorians and the livelihoods of Territorians, and to ensure that we kept those very important COVID vaccinations here for Territorians first and foremost. And Madam Speaker, I'm sure that the Treasurer is very aware of this. It was just before he entered his position in the Parliament in 2020. And the impact of that is still felt today. And I'm not sure if the Treasurer's aware, because it sounds like he's still reading the 101 on accounting on how to be a Treasurer and do a first budget. But the impact of COVID resulted in a global recession from which no jurisdiction has been immune to, including the Northern Territory. And we have since seen global unrest, supply chain disruptions, the rise in cost for goods, particularly building materials, and inflation, Madam Speaker. The Territory has not escaped the economic ripples from these external global factors. And in an age where misinformation and disinformation are massively impacting people's faith in public institutions, it is disappointing to hear the Treasurer's extremely distorted take on the Territory budget. He has clearly received briefings from Treasury about the broader context, Madam Speaker, but only chooses to follow his party lines. So it has to be assumed that he is deliberately not telling the whole truth to Territorians when he plays the blame game around the Territory budget story and history. Because we know, Madam Speaker, the CLP love talking about the 8-year history of the former Labor government, and yet they don't talk about any of the history of the budget when it comes to the impact and those factors that I've just mentioned that have created some of the complexities and the challenges that are now being faced by the Territory's economy. Madam Speaker, there's no doubt that the Territory is facing fiscal challenges, and this is hardly a secret to anyone, especially anyone who knows how to read a budget paper. Madam Speaker, the former Labor government worked hard to instill budget discipline, and hence why the budget ceiling was put in. To control the budget spending was very difficult in the fiscal environment, but this was balanced with the need that was met for Territorians.
Please take your seat, Leader of Government Business. What's your point of order, Member for Drysdale?
As much as I'm enjoying this work of fiction, Standing Order 35, relevance to subject, I would ask the opposition leader to bring it back. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Drysdale, this is a long speech, potentially 45 minutes. The Leader of the Opposition has been given the usual slack and latitude that all members get, particularly for longer speeches, and I think she is speaking relevantly to the topic.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm quite confused as what the member for Drysdale thinks that when I'm talking about budget discipline, controlling budget, fiscal environment, balance with community expectations, public spending, public infrastructure, health, roads, education, community safety, how that would not be relevant to the bill. Maybe as a backbencher he hasn't been privy to the bill, maybe he hasn't done his homework about the bill, maybe the Treasurer and the CLP government don't share information or do briefings with their own CLP members. They're just blindly supposed to follow the vote on the floor without having actually been supported to understand what legislation is as a new member. So I really hope the Treasurer offers that, particularly before the budget, to the backbenchers, because you'll get your little packs, you'll get your books when the budget gets delivered in May. Hopefully it's not the first time you get to see the budget at all from your team, and that you have no surprises like what we saw with the cuts to the undergrounding high voltage program, which the CLP did not tell people prior to the election, Madam Speaker, and the 10-year program for the high voltage underground power in the northern suburbs and the older suburbs of Darwin was completely cut off the table, was completely blindsided to Territorians, and I did not hear a single northern suburbs or Darwin suburbs member of the CLP government, predominantly or backbenchers, say that they had gone out to tell Territorians in their prospective electorates and now their current electorates as local members that that's what they plan to do as the CLP government got in. It was completely brand new news, Madam Speaker. So when they talk about being open and transparent and honest with Territorians, this is another example, which I wasn't even going to mention, Madam Speaker, until the member for Drysdale thought that I was off topic, but that's another one when we're talking about budget accountability and measures. So again, acknowledging that you cannot tell Territorians one thing and do another, and you cannot not tell Territorians that you're going to do something and then take it off the table. So I hope that the CLP government can look those constituents in the eye and tell them that they were shortchanged behind their backs because of a decision that was made and not shared in secret by the CLP members. Madam Speaker, the former Labor government focused on spending in the following areas. Investing in additional police, and I know that the Chief Minister takes great pleasure in going to the police graduations and visiting the police academy to take credit for the great work of the police force. We do love the police and we do want to support the police, and that's why the former Labor government invested in the police force, Madam Speaker. But you would think that the 7 months of the CLP government has just suddenly created a new platform and a new program of funding for the police, which is absolute rubbish. You just have to look at the work that was done formerly, and they love their history lessons, so let's go and hope that they learn from their own readings with that one, Madam Speaker. Another area that was focused on, Madam Speaker, was striking an agreement with the federal government to fully fund every public school in the Northern Territory. This was a huge win, Madam Speaker. $1 billion of funding in education. And we asked some very important questions at the end of last year, Madam Speaker, to the Education Minister, the member for Katherine, Joe Hersey, to ensure that the protection of that bilateral agreement would be safeguarded from the CLP trying to rub their hands together and say, oh, look at all this money over here, we're going to spend it somewhere else where it's not actually intended for, which is to fully resource our Territory public schools. And that was the work of the former Labor government, and a legacy that if the CLP government would like to continue, then we are happy to support them to do the right thing and to spend the money in the right way, which is supporting our Territory public schools and to be funded properly. Madam Speaker, another focus area was directing an extra $300 million over the last 2 years to meet and to improve the demand of our Territory health system. Madam Speaker, what I learnt when I was the Health Minister, formerly, was that the Northern Territory, one of the jurisdictions that has some of the most complex health issues in the country, is the least funded jurisdiction in Australia when it comes to hospital funding. We're down at just over 30%, 30-something percent. I'm sure the Health Minister can tell us the exact figure. And the next jurisdiction that is the second lowest funded hospital jurisdiction in the country is South Australia at 37%. New South Wales and some of those bigger states are up at about 40, 42 from memory, 42%, Madam Speaker. How could the Northern Territory ever get ahead if we do not have equity in our hospital funding? When we have several large regional hospitals and main hospitals, small clinics, communities that are serviced also by Aboriginal medical services, how can we ever get ahead with the complexities of Territorians, and particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Territorians, dying 20 years younger than non-Aboriginal and non-Torres Strait Islander Territorians? So the funding, when it is used properly, when we are resourced properly in the Territory, makes a huge difference. This is a life or death area of funding, Madam Speaker, health. And I sincerely hope that the member for Berkeley, as the new Health Minister, Madam Speaker, takes up that fight to the federal government to ensure that Territory, even if we're not funded the most jurisdictions for the hospital funding, Madam Speaker, but the Territory is equitably funded for hospital funding in our budget, so that we can ensure Territorians get a better cut of the health funding nationally, but that we have a better deal for Territorians when it comes to our health services and access to our health services, and improving the quality of our health infrastructure so our hardworking health professionals can deliver quality health services for Territorians. And Madam Speaker, the other important area of focus when our former Labor government was in power was ensuring that we had record investment in infrastructure, particularly on roads, to make them safer, more accessible, more efficient, And to do that, not just in the heavily populated parts of the territory, but all parts of the territory, all our roads, all our access areas, Madam Speaker, because we have pastoralists, we have tourism, we have remote communities and homelands, and the benefit of infrastructure and the investment in improving roads infrastructure, creeks, river crossings, bridges, all of that makes a big difference to not just Territorians, but those who come to visit the territory for tourism, but those who come to do business here in the territory, and including our defence infrastructure investment here in the territory, Madam Speaker. So I really hope, almost like with all fingers and toes crossed, that the Treasurer and his infrastructure portfolio continues to invest and doesn't cut the investment when it comes to life-saving road infrastructure, as well as economic growth infrastructure when it comes to the investment in roads and accessibility, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the former Territory Labor government also invested in attracting and stimulating private sector investment. The focus was, of course, creating jobs and ensuring that there were pathways that would lead to strong and sustainable economy and diversifying the territory economy. It is highly concerning when we see the CLP government imply that these investments were wasteful. It is concerning, Madam Speaker, because it suggests a fundamental lack of understanding about growing the economy. We have not heard yet, Madam Speaker, of the CLP's economic vision for the future. Yes, they've got a plan, they write everything up, but it's nothing new. What is the new vision? What is their thinking out of the box? Or do they just expect to do the same as what they did years and years ago when they were in government and not get anywhere? Madam Speaker, I know that, of course, yourself and the Treasurer hail from Alice Springs, and it is difficult to understand why the Treasurer, being an Alice Springs resident and representing people in Central Australia, would even think that wasting money or cutting money to the budget of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Gallery of Australia is something that the people of Central Australia want. The many businesses that I've had the honour and privilege to meet with and talk to, particularly in Alice Springs Township, but also around that Central Australian region, have all been geared over the last few years for this record investment of infrastructure, of opportunity, of jobs that the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Gallery would bring to the heart of Australia, Madam Speaker, to Alice Springs, to Mumbatwa, to Central Australia. And yet we have an Alice Springs-based Treasurer, well, when he's there, we have an Alice Springs-based Treasurer cutting one of the most important jobs creating and tourism investing project of recent times for Alice Springs. And how he holds his head up when he walks around Alice Springs, I won't know. That's up for the people of Alice Springs and his electorate to judge. But this, I've heard businesses, Madam Speaker, in Alice Springs say that they have made investment decisions based on this infrastructure, based on this planning, based on this commitment. And literally within, I think it was a couple of weeks of the CLP winning the territory election, they came in with a swoop of, well, actually, we're going to downsize the gallery now. It's not going to be a project of national significance. And oh, by the way, the project will now be smaller than one of the regional museums, Shepparton in Victoria. It will be smaller than that regional museum. So a project of national significance now downgraded for the people of Alice Springs, the businesses of Alice Springs and the opportunities of Alice Springs, because the CLP thinks they know better than all of the years of planning, consultation, the ups and downs of those processes. And how do they now explain to businesses all of the choices you made in the last few years is really for nothing? Say goodbye to the extra dollars for Central Australia, which I know, Madam Speaker, would absolutely benefit from it. And it sounds like the Treasurer has not spoken to the tourism sector in his own town of Alice Springs and the businesses locally, and those who are gearing up for this economic and social game changer for the town and for the Territory, Madam Speaker. And instead, what have they replaced it with? A smaller project? How are they going to boost, how's the CLP government going to boost what was going to be delivered by this project of national significance? What is the CLP government going to do, Madam Speaker, when it comes to job creation in Central Australia? Perhaps the Treasurer will speak about that. Maybe he'll enlighten that. And we know, Madam Speaker, the Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, criticised and scrapped this project. I think maybe probably not even talking to the Treasurer, I think only talking to the member for Breitling, maybe to give him a bit of a boosted ego because he nearly lost his seat to the Greens. I think the Greens were closing in pretty closely for Breitling, leaving entire businesses and communities in Central Australia, particularly in Alice Springs, scratching their heads over the complete lack of economic foresight or vision from the new CLP government. Madam Speaker, we want to see the new government talk about responsible budget management, but scrapping this project, this nationally significant project that was calculated, that was costed, that was future thinking and future planning for jobs and for the economy of Alice Springs and Central Australia. This is a completely baffling move by a new government. And, Madam Speaker, this is not necessarily even just what the Labor opposition think. This is what many businesses and community members have told the Labor opposition in our time there over the last 7 months. And people who've actually reached out to us and asked us specifically to raise these points. Similarly, Madam Speaker, we've seen the Treasurer rip money out of road infrastructure projects, and the failed attempt with the example case in point of the Wadair Road until they were caught out, until they had to face the 600+ petition by the people of the West Daly region and particularly the Wadair community, the 100 or so people who travelled in from their community to present a petition to my colleague, the Deputy Opposition Leader, the member for Daly, Gerard, until that pressure was placed on the CLP and particularly the Treasurer to talk about or to commit to that Wadair Road and the sealing of it. They're trying to do sneaky things, Madam Speaker, and this does not go to what they're presenting here today, the bill, does not go to the heart of what they promised Territorians they were doing, being open, accountable and transparent. Madam Speaker, those critical infrastructure projects, and I would expect the Treasurer to know this, create jobs, they stimulate the economy, and they provide opportunities for Territory businesses to grow and to thrive. And eventually, we'll see the budget in May. We will see if there is an economic vision for Territorians. But I don't think we're going to see anything before that, Madam Speaker. So I will be eagerly awaiting my budget pack on budget day and going through, as I've done every single year as a backbencher, as a minister, and now in the opposition role, with my ruler and highlighter and pen, with my old school teacher tactics, and following every single budget paper line, particularly the infrastructure budget paper. Because, Madam Speaker, once we see that information, we'll be able to go out and tell Territorians, businesses, companies, those who have been tendering for projects, if they are wasting their time because the CLP government doesn't believe in investing in infrastructure, roads, the critical investment that will make a big difference to the Territory. So I'll be waiting eagerly on budget day for that, Madam Speaker. And our local businesses, Madam Speaker, we want to see the opportunities for projects grow for them and to benefit Territorians in general. Again, the lack of foresight, vision and the ability for the CLP government to see the long game is disappointing and deeply concerning, not just for the Territory Labor opposition, but for all Territorians. And for businesses, I've spoken particularly over the last 2 weeks, Madam Speaker, at the start of March, some huge industry and business players who are yet to be impressed with anything that the CLP government has done or said or presented when it comes to the economic plan and vision and forward thinking of the Territory's economy. I look forward to supporting some of that vision if we think as a Labor opposition it will be beneficial for Territorians and businesses and industry, but I have to see it to make an informed opinion, to talk to people, to voice concerns, to celebrate good ideas, but nothing. The only response, Madam Speaker, we've had from the CLP so far around the economic vision is, oh, out of a team of 17, we have no ideas. We are going to rest all of our hopes and dreams and aspirations for the Territory's future on a single position of the Territory Coordinator. So not a single member of the 17-strong CLP government has provided an economic vision. They've all said, oh, wait till the Territory Coordinator bill's passed, wait till the Territory Coordinator is then instilled in legislation, and they'll have all the answers for the Territory. I don't know why people ran for their seats if they don't have something positive to contribute around the idea and the future of the Territory's economy, because that was one of the 3 main things the CLP members all promised, all the candidates, as well as the current sitting members, and most of them became ministers as well. Madam Speaker, we'll continue to be concerned about some of the language the Treasurer has used, signalling almost that there's ready, that the time now will be ready to take an axe and limit funding agreements. And one of the most concerning conversations I have around the Northern Territory as the opposition leader, Madam Speaker, is small organisations, particularly those community service organisations that deliver some very critical programs to support vulnerable and disadvantaged Territorians, say that they are absolutely worried and concerned about the CLP's lack of engagement with them as a service provider, because if they speak up, they feel that they will be then targeted and their programs, their organisation will then be cut of funding. What a terrible place the Territory will become over the next couple of years, Madam Speaker, if there is not robust scrutiny and questions asked of the government. If organisations are too frightened to ask questions or display their concerns about their funding, that they will then be punished if they speak up about how they are struggling to continue to deliver services or expand some already at capacity service, like some of the ones I've met in Alice Springs, that they will be punished for raising this with the government. And I have never, in 9 years of being a parliamentarian, heard a single organisation say that if they speak up that they are worried that their funding will get axed. But we are now in a very different era, Madam Speaker. I'm absolutely not going to name the organisations or associations. I just hope that if they do come to the government and air those concerns, and many of them are talking about airing them in private, not publicly and openly in the media, but if they do, that they are given the time and the respect of the CLP government and that they will not be punished for airing their concerns or sharing their ideas on how funding, continued funding in terms of agreements, or how specific funding will be able to support the programs that are desperately needed in the community service sector. Madam Speaker, we know that shiny new slogans, particularly for 2025, will not actually help the CLP get the job done. They are starting to show a track record of inaction, uncertainty and insecurity for the Territory. That is not a great way to start the 7 months of government. Madam Speaker, on the other hand, they've spent a lot of time carefully crafting their media releases, carefully wording media releases, taking up the numbers of their government-backed private sector projects underway across the Territory, and this has left many people confused, worried, concerned. Madam Speaker, just last week, the Deputy Chief Minister, the member for Nelson, noted in a press release that the petroleum and mineral exploration in the Territory had reached $545 million in 2024, the second highest combined annual exploration investment ever recorded in the Territory. But of course didn't say that majority of this work happened under Labor. They like picking and choosing the project. If it's something that's, you know, mud's hit the fan, then they'll blame the former Labor government. If it's a great story, yep, we'll get in front of it, we'll claim it, and we won't acknowledge any of the hard work of the public service in the prior government. Madam Speaker, under Standing Order 43, can I please request an extension of time?
Is extension supported? Please continue.
Cheeky. I was just talking about you too, Member for Nelson. You should enjoy listening to this. It's about you. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this is a great achievement to celebrate, and I commend the member for Nelson in his portfolio for sharing that really great story about investment in the Territory. But I do ask that he show a little bit of humility at times when needed and acknowledge some of the work that's happened before August 2024. Madam Speaker, in another release, again, member for Nelson, I told you you'd enjoy this, it's about you again. He spruiked the Barossa project, Madam Speaker, which is getting close to completion and is set to deliver its first gas in 2025, later this year. The Deputy Chief Minister was also excited in his press release and carefully worded media announcements to speak about the lease agreement with Duxton Farms Limited as part of developing the Wildman Agricultural Development Hub. Madam Speaker, this is a project that will significantly expand and diversify our agricultural sector. We commend the concentration of the work of the CLP to follow on from this great leave of the former Labor government. But we want to ensure that, from our side, we want to be constructive as the Labor opposition, that if there are hiccups along the way, if there are project delays, if there are blowouts in cost, that the CLP will do their best as a responsible government, maybe I'm using that term too loosely, as a government of the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker, and ensure they do everything in their capacity to support that particular development hub, which will mean a great deal to improving the Territory's economy and to give investors and future business proprietors in the Territory comfort and excitement about why the Territory can be the best place to do business. Watching the clock count down now. Oh, do I have another story about you? Yes, I do, member for Nelson. I got another story about you. So you don't have to watch the clock. It's all going to be about you. Madam Speaker, the member for Nelson was equally excited through his announcements and his press release about the Pan-African Resources acquisition of Tennant Consolidated Mining Group. This will... Pardon?
Order.
Oh, come on now.
Let's focus.
Too late. People have had long nights, Madam Speaker. Just need to relax. The Tennant Consolidated Mining Group, Madam Speaker, which will underpin the development of the group's gold processing plant at Nobles Knob, a project that will help revitalise the Barkly as a mining hub. The member for Nelson in his press release, Madam Speaker, noted that Tennant Mining had benefited from a $10 million Northern Territory Government Local Jobs Fund loan to make this a reality. And Madam Speaker, I absolutely had the pleasure of visiting on site with Tennant Mining just a couple of weeks ago in the great region of the Barkly. I know the member for Barkly loves it. What about the Barkly? What about the Barkly, Madam Speaker? It is an economic gold mine, literally an economic gold mine. I got to visit the Tennant Mining development, and the member for Barkly loves these stories. I got to visit Tennant Mining and Nobles Knob and see an amazing amount of progress. It absolutely is, Madam Speaker. The Barkly is full of opportunities, as I said, literally a gold mine. And the work that had happened in literally 12 months, formerly started under the Labor government, The company was extremely complimentary of the fast tracking of that project under the former Labor government and the very impressive infrastructure that has now progressed. One of the great stories for this investment and the new development with Tennant Mining, Madam Speaker, is the local jobs that have been committed by I'll make sure I say their full name properly, by Pan African Resources, Tennant Mining. They have got a plan around, one, local Warramungu people having first choice of jobs, local Tennant Creek community and residents, and then local Barkly residents, and then Australians and other people who want to come and work at the Tennant mine. And this was a great comfort for me, Madam Speaker, to see some of that great work and the legacy started under our former government, but something that will literally be a game changer, not just for the Northern Territory, but for the Barkly region. It was a great story, and I know the member for Barkly is a big supporter of this project as the local member, acknowledging that. But to hear and to see how quickly that project has come online was a great comfort and a great opportunity to really understand the processes and the regulations. I've never held the mining portfolio, Madam Speaker. I do have a very large mine in my electorate. But to understand the processes from the business side of starting a new mine in the Northern Territory. So that was very interesting. I learnt a lot. But to see that process now well underway, I'm sure the member for Barkly will be there to cut the ribbon when it does officially open. But to see that process underway and how much, understanding how much and celebrating how much that project is going to make a difference for the Barkly region, the people there and the jobs and the opportunities that will follow. Member for Nelson, that's enough of talking about all your press releases. But Madam Speaker, I do want to point out that they all have one thing in common, that every press release that the member for Nelson has backed was launched or started under the former Labor government. So thank you, Member for Nelson, for indiscreetly celebrating the work of the former Labor government, because often too proud to actually acknowledge that work, Madam Speaker. But it's there in black and white if anyone wants to see those press releases. Madam Speaker, in just the 6/7 months that the CLP has been in power, they have not announced a single new project. So I look forward to seeing that, other than the one project that they have announced is a new jail. And we know that's going to be, hope Treasury closes their ears on this one, close to $1 billion for that infrastructure. So we will see what the legacy of the CLP government is. And when we talk about population growth or population attraction to the Northern Territory, we've heard the Chief Minister rubbish the arts community and say, oh, people don't want to, and the member for Brennan has done it too, Madam Speaker, as her faithful follower. People don't want art galleries. They want prisons. They want to see prisons. So how is, Madam Speaker, the CLP government intending to attract those much-needed health workers and those essential service workers to the Territory? What are they going to do when they have their days off or their weekends or they have family come to the Northern Territory? Come right this way, let's tour the new prison. That's all we've got because that's our legacy as a new government. Come right here and see this new jail because that's what we've invested our $1 billion in. And the rest of your time you can just either be at work, go to the shops, in and out, and that's it. We have nothing about livability and lifestyle of the Northern Territory CLP government in any of their forward planning. Quite astounding. And I know they're all eagerly listening because we are too, Madam Speaker. We are listening eagerly in the Territory Labor opposition of what project announcements, other than a new jail, the CLP will be putting to restore our Territory lifestyle or stimulating our Northern Territory economy. We wait. We won't hold our breath because we'll probably suffocate, but we'll be waiting very eagerly, Madam Speaker. And they've so obsessed, Madam Speaker, with the shade structure. It was a pilot project. So obsessed. And Madam Speaker, let's hear them all laugh at this one. The wood from the shade structure came from the Gumatj timber. It was made by Gumatj people, and they all laugh at that. So I will be making sure I let the Gumatj mob know that the CLP government continues to laugh at their entity, the Gumatj timber, that was shipped from Nhulunbuy to Darwin for that pilot project. So I will make sure that I tell the Gumatj mob how much they are respected by the CLP government, who just laugh at their business and their entity. Madam Speaker, I could go on, and I wish I had another opportunity to extend my time. I know I've got them all rolled up. So, Madam Speaker, again, the Labor opposition will absolutely not be supporting this bill and the legislation by the CLP, who is scared of transparency, openness and accountability.
Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise to support this bill. Look, I am not going to be able to do my contribution anywhere near as wonderful as the Leader of the Opposition, because that was a beautiful speech. But I can answer a few things, Madam Speaker. When you're here working and you've got yourself a job, what you can do, you can go to the jail if you commit a crime, but you could also go goose hunting, and our new pathway would be built out in Harrison Dam, and you could also catch $1 million barramundi that the CLP introduced many, many years ago. So there are wonderful things to do here in the Northern Territory. Yes, Madam. The Treasurer's noodle gets sunburn under that. So, Madam Speaker, this bill enacts legislation to repeal the limit on borrowing, commonly referred to as the debt ceiling. The $15 billion debt ceiling was introduced by the former Labor Chief Minister Michael Gunner in May 2021. That was because the failed Chief Minister couldn't trust himself or his Labor government to rein in spending. Madam Speaker, during the 2021 estimates, Michael Gunner said, and I'll quote, "This will strengthen accountability for our long-term debt reduction goals and send a clear message to the rating agencies that the government is continuing its budget repair program." Budget repair program. What a joke. Should be a stand-up comedian. Madam Speaker, back in 2018, just weeks before Christmas, the Gunner Labor government dropped a physical bombshell. It said the Territory was on track to rack up more than $35 billion by 2030. $35 billion by 2030. How many zeros? A lot. Madam Speaker, and I just want to remind the House that when the former government, mere 8 and a bit years ago, came to office, the debt was about 1.8, maybe 1.9, somewhere around there. So $1 billion a year, Madam Speaker, and yet our government is continuing to its budget repair program. Madam Speaker, the former Labor government admitted it was borrowing cash just to cover basic operating expenses. Labor was also borrowing to pay the interest on its ballooning loans. In March 2019, economist John Langland released a blueprint for budget repair. One of the 76 recommendations was the creation of a debt ceiling. Rather than being a cap on net debt or liabilities, the ceiling was a cap on total borrowing minus finance leases. Put simply, the legislation Labor introduced gave itself the green light to keep on spending beyond its means, and spend they did. Madam Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition said that I should acknowledge some of the things that the Labor government have done and how good they are. Madam Speaker, I will acknowledge this Labor government have put us in about $11 billion worth of debt. So they were very, very good at their spending. So I do acknowledge the Leader of the Opposition, what Labor have done, and they have put us into a world of hurt. Madam Speaker, by the time Michael Gunner resigned in May 2022, the debt had more than tripled since he came to office. When Territorians voted this CLP government into office, the debt sat at $11 billion. So just 18 months, the previous government decreased I'll start again. In just 18 months, the previous government debt increased by $2 billion. I didn't want to get that wrong. I'm almost going to say decreased. And how wrong could we be? But where has that money gone? What have you got to show for it? We've got a structure in Kavanagh Street. I don't call it a shade structure. I call it a structure in Kavanagh Street. We've got a highway where no matter where you travel, down through the centre or east or west, that gets cut every year. What our government is doing, which is in stark contrast to what the former Labor government doing, is to be upfront with Territorians. Treasurer Bill Yan has laid out the bare of the Territory's two economic challenges. During his statewide tour economy roadshow, Treasurer Yan highlighted Labor's failures on this approach, noting a record spending in police, the highest per capita in the nation, without corresponding investments in corrections or the courts. That's not a strategy, Madam Speaker, that's an imbalance. No long-term funding for corrections, which requires an estimated $50 million annually, which resulted in our crime going through the roof. He emphasised that for every dollar spent on police, at least $1.50 should be invested in the broader justice system, including legal services, courts and prisons. We can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results. That's madness. The decision to repeal the debt ceiling is a difficult but necessary one, and if we didn't do it, we'd be forced to make cuts, something that we simply won't do. We won't punish Territorians, Madam Speaker, for Labor's mistakes. Costly mistakes. Madam Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition also told the House that she's going to get out her ruler and pen and read the budget books word for word. Madam Speaker, I've also done that. And I've done that in the 2024 budget. And Madam Speaker, in the 2024 pre-election Fiscal Outlook report, which is in there in black and white, and I asked the Opposition Leader to go and get that and have a read of it, because it talks about it was planning significant cuts to critical services. So this is in their own budget book, Madam Speaker. It's a public document, and if you do have the time to read it, turn to page 40, Madam Speaker, and have a read of what it says at page 40, about 3/4 of the way down. Territory-funded items that are currently budgeted to reduce or cease over the forward estimates include supplementary funding to support hospitals and corrections cost pressures. So, Madam Speaker, there are also time-limited funding for domestic, family and sexual violence to reduce programs. So, Madam Speaker, taking the Leader's Opposition's own advice and reading the budget book would tell you at page 40 they were going to cut the hospitals and corrections. Cut the hospitals, Madam Speaker. And domestic violence, which two parts of the Territory which are drastically needed and required. We know that domestic and family violence is a scourge. You know, in the Labor government it kept going up. I think it was 82% increase in domestic and family violence. So, Madam Speaker, just let that think in, that this government want me to acknowledge what they've done, so I have acknowledged that they've overspent, put our debt up, and they acknowledged that they were going to cut the hospitals and corrections. And they were going to cut domestic violence. That's because Labor was so physically inept. Hospitals and corrections and DV prevention programs were going to be cut. Madam Speaker, it just laughs in the face of how the opposition, and that's why they're in opposition, because they're going to cut these crucial programs which keep the Territory safe and also keep the Territory in a healthy way. If you get sick, you should be able to go to the doctor. You should be able to go to the hospital. And if you're a victim of domestic violence, you should need help, and you need to make sure that you're safe. The Opposition Leader knew the funding for hospitals, corrections and domestic violence programs were coming to an end. She was in the Budget Cabinet. She knew about it. She knew about it in detail, Madam Speaker, and yet what did she do about it? Absolutely nothing. What a shame. Repealing the debt ceiling will give the government more flexibility to manage spending, address immediate budget pressures and plan for long-term financial stability, something the Labor government neglected to do. It will also allow for a stronger focus on boosting revenue and improving spending efficiency. The previous government set a debt ceiling knowing it would break. Rather than acting responsibility, it did everything it possibly could to disguise and hide and cover the truth. Madam Speaker, Labor deliberately excluded ongoing project funding from the forward estimates to mislead Territorians. The time-limited funding, Madam Speaker, they would put a program out and they would lock it in and they would fund it for 1 year and then they wouldn't fund it anymore. Because, Madam Speaker, because they knew if they did, they would breach their own debt ceiling. This was a deliberate attempt to hide the fact that Labor was driving the Territory into deeper debt. The previous government's actions were a betrayal of Territorians. Labor deliberately hid the truth, pushing its inevitable debt ceiling breach just beyond the forward estimates to avoid accountability before the election. Had Labor been re-elected, it would now be scrambling to explain why it smashed its own debt limit and plunged the Territory into further financial chaos. Instead of investing in crucial infrastructure like healthcare, aged care, mental health, priorities that matter to Territorians, it wasted taxpayers' pet projects like shade structures, art galleries, playgrounds, and of course my favourite, the $5,000 Christmas tree. Madam Speaker, Labor abandoned the needs of Territorians, leaving us with a deep financial mess and nothing to show for it. And the Treasurer has got a difficult job, and I've been working with him lately, and he's got his calculator out, and he's got a special calculator because he needs one because the debt is that bad. Madam Speaker, the CLP here today are putting Territorians first. That's what they voted for and that's what they deserve. I commend this bill to the House.
Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I also rise to address the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Amendment Bill. Madam Speaker, this bill is yet another example of the CLP removing transparency from their decision-making and with it opportunities for the public to hold the government to account for their decisions. Madam Speaker, the purpose of Parliament is to be accountable to the people, and as the Treasurer has said, the NT was always going to go over our borrowing limit, meaning the only effect this amendment will have is to remove the requirement for the Treasurer to produce a report addressing why more money was borrowed. It's not too much to ask that the Treasurer explain why money is borrowed. This is particularly true when we're speaking about a jurisdiction with complex and unique funding needs, and it's particularly true when we already suffer from a lack of accountability about how funds intended for one purpose are used for another. Despite the championing of large private industry that goes on in this chamber, the mining and gas industries are not the backbone of the NT economy, the public and the community sector is. The public and the community sector is the largest contributor to the NT economy, to jobs, to growth and to the gross state product. The NT economy is public and that has always been the case, and that it's not going to change regardless of what members in this chamber might like to believe. In the NT, managing the economy, the service it funds and the social needs it meets managing public money. Our economy is not separate from our society. We can't manage the economy's needs without managing our society's needs. Madam Speaker, we often talk about the economy as if it's a separate entity devoid of any relationship to the health of our society, but the opposite is true. A helpful way to think about the economy as a measure of the health of our society. All the decisions that governments make affect the economy. They affect what services get money, which corporations mine our land, which groups of people get support and who's left behind. All of these decisions bear a cost, and all of these decisions contribute to whether a government is or isn't responsibly managing the economy. To manage the economy responsibly, we first must govern responsibly. Madam Speaker, I was motivated to run for politics in the Northern Territory and speak up for my electorate of Johnston because when I look around this place, I can see that wealth in the Northern Territory is not being shared. I see some people getting very rich, benefiting greatly from the opportunities available. When I drive to work through Fanny Bay and Bayview, past many beautiful houses and large swimming pools and boats, I can see that some Territorians are doing very well here and that economic growth is making some Territorians very wealthy and very comfortable. But I know that that is only happening for some Territorians. From the work that I've been doing in communities over the past 30 years, I've seen and I've experienced firsthand that many Territorians are not getting wealthier. They are not benefiting from the Northern Territory's economic development story. To the contrary, many Territorians are becoming poorer. There may be wealth created in some places in the Northern Territory, but the story on the ground, and especially in remote communities, is that many people are not receiving any share of that new wealth. This is not just my observations, but it's the story I hear from so many people who I speak to in my electorate. We've all been watching as the gap between rich and poor in the Territory grows wider. The recent 2021 National Census showed us that Indigenous policy in the Northern Territory is getting worse fast. Between 2016 and 2021, there was a 10 to 13% increase in Indigenous poverty rates in most places around the Northern Territory. In other words, an average First Nations person living in Katherine or Borroloola or Tennant Creek or Yuendamu or Wadeye had 10% less money to spend in real terms in 2021 compared to what they had in 2016. Territorians in our regional and remote areas are growing poorer, not richer. We all intuitively know this. If you lived in Darwin for a long time, like I have, then you know and feel that many people are growing poorer, that disadvantaged Territorians are going through hard times and receiving less support than they used to. I want to draw the attention of the Chamber to the actual source of the Northern Territory Government's revenue, why the government gets that money and what we should be doing about it. In short, all of us today, and all of those working in government offices in Darwin, have generous GST distributions from Canberra to thank for our generous salaries and comfortable Territory lifestyles. These generous GST distributions are given to the Northern Territory in recognition of the high need in the Northern Territory. That is, that we experience unique remoteness and disadvantage of the Territory compared to other parts of Australia. The key takeaway, Madam Speaker, here is that because of the disadvantage and remoteness of the Northern Territory's population, the Northern Territory Government receives very high federal funding levels from Canberra. But the reality on the ground is that much of the money the Northern Territory receives from Canberra never reaches the Territorians most in need, the Territorians that it was intended to reach. Madam Speaker, this is the major reason that I raise concerns about the NT debt ceiling and reporting requirements being lifted. Successive governments have been mismanaging money in the Northern Territory and we're paying for it in social costs. If social needs like safe and secure housing, access to healthcare go unaddressed, they get worse for the people going without and they get more costly for the society as a whole. To manage the economy responsibly, I say again, we must govern responsibly. We need more transparency and accountability regarding how this money is spent before we should allow the government to borrow more. I want to be clear that some debt is fine, some debt is good. Borrowing now to make our future better is a good idea, just like a person borrowing money now to own a house outright later is a good idea. But there are two parts to this question. If you borrow now and mismanage that money, you don't get the benefits of your borrowing later and you still get saddled with the debt. Madam Speaker, it's important to know that there is a reason we had the debt cap and associated reporting requirements put in the first place. The NT's debt to gross state produce ratio is the highest in the country by a long way. And despite what the members of this chamber will tell you, we're not going to get out of this hole by boosting our gross state product with fanciful private development. We'll get out of this hole by managing our money better. Managing our money better means funding the services we need now so we don't pay the cost of unaddressed need later on. Many of us might not realise that the generous GST distributions the NT receives are the result of Canberra's approach to addressing disadvantages in the NT. The very high GST distributions we receive are intended to ensure that we have the same opportunity as other states and territories around Australia to provide our residents with comparable services. For example, the GST distributions are designed to balance out geographic and demographic disadvantages that individual states have and ensure that all states and territories can afford to provide a decent standard of service and care. This process is called the horizontal fiscal equalisation, and it's a method to balance out inequalities between states and territories through differentiated GST distributions. So, recognising the unique challenges of the NT, our government receives 5 times as much funding through the GST per person compared to all the other states and territories. The Northern Territory government receives well over half its funding from the Commonwealth government through GST distributions and grants. This is money the federal government in Canberra is providing to the Northern Territory government to provide services and infrastructure. According to the NT government budget papers from the 24-25 financial year, the NT government has an annual revenue of $8.7 billion. This is the annual budget of the NT government to spend on all services. And of that $8.7 billion, almost half, or $4.2 billion, comes from GST distributions. So this means, obviously, that half of all services provided by the government is funded thanks to those GST distributions. I note for my fellow members that all of this information is publicly available in the NT budget papers from the Commonwealth Grants Commission submissions to the 2023 Senate inquiry into the extent and nature of poverty in Australia and the 2023 Closing the Gap review, CAP review, and from the Commonwealth Government resources about GST distribution. And it's been a deep dive for me learning about this because it's a new area for me, but I wanted to try and get my head around it. So I'm saying again that the Northern Territory receives a lot of money from Canberra because of the very high need of remote Territorians, and yet much of that money never reaches those Territorians. Instead, much of it stays here in Darwin, in our pockets and on our streets. Remote Territorians continue to become poorer, and meanwhile economic development in the NT appears to be benefiting those of us here in the city. A friend who'd never been to Darwin before came to visit me this week, and this inequality was stark to her and confronting from the first glance. It doesn't make much to understand that inequality in the NT needs addressing urgently, and it cannot be addressed without needs-based GST funding going to the people that it is intended to help. We should not be borrowing more money before we can confidently say we're spending the money as it was intended to be spent and addressing the inequality it was intended to address. We can't confidently say we're justified in borrowing more money if we do not know what we're borrowing or why. And that's what this amendment really is about. It's about letting the government borrow more money before it's been held accountable for the money intended for remote Territorians that it's spent in other places. How the budget is spent and why must be transparent. When our economy is dependent on public funding and services, we cannot fix the economy without transparency in government. Madam Speaker, I'll say again, for the benefit of the chamber, that the public and community sector is the largest contributor to the NT economy, to jobs, to growth and to gross state product. We're not going to fix inequality by approving more mines. We'll make it worse. We're not going to fix inequality by fracking Beetaloo Basin and greenlighting Middle Arm. And we won't fix inequality with the Territory Coordinator. Major private development plays a minuscule role in the NT economy. As we heard yesterday from the Treasurer, fracking in the Beetaloo Basin is only projected to raise $8 million in revenue a year. $8 million may sound like a lot, but when it comes to the scale of the Territory budget, it's not even enough to run Royal Darwin Hospital for a single day. The annual budget for the Territory is over $8 billion, not $8 million. The NT economy is dependent on public funds and public sector jobs. Major private investment has never played a major role in the NT economy and the standard of living for most Territorians, and it never will. By continuing to insist on big business development and on oil and gas, the government is gambling with taxpayer money. Instead of making responsible choices, ensuring money intended to help vulnerable people in our society gets to them, they are repeatedly taking unfounded risks. It's not the job of the private sector to regulate the economy or the budget, it's the job of the government. Our economy does not need wishful thinking, it needs integrity and accountability. Governing responsibly means making decisions that are responsible to look after our long-term future and avoid further and endemic social costs. We need fiscal integrity measures like this debt cap, Madam Speaker, because it's overwhelmingly clear that the government is managing taxpayer money without integrity. You do not have to take my word for it, Madam Speaker. You can listen to the ministers when they say, I stand proudly with the Ministers' Council and we are sending a signal that the Territory is open for business, and drill, baby, drill. I just want to note that that's about the 5th time I've heard Trump quoted and cheered in this chamber, and it makes me ashamed. Managing the NT budget and the NT economy is not an easy task. It requires intelligence, it requires integrity, it requires planning, and it requires transparency. Removing reporting requirements for borrowing beyond a $15 billion debt cap without any plans in place to address how we got there in the first place is not responsible government. Removing reporting requirements for borrowing while we have the most stark inequality in the country with no plans to address the misappropriation of public funds designed to mitigate the inequality is not responsible government. Madam Speaker, it's also important to me when I speak in this chamber to provide an alternative way forward. What I hope for is for us to find a pathway to better include and empower regional and remote leaders to have a say in how money is spent in the Northern Territory. Not all decisions about how money is spent in Darwin should be made by our largely homogenous government bureaucrats. Instead, we need to find better ways to share power. To address worsening poverty in our regions and remote areas, we need to get better at listening to the voices outside of Darwin. I've had the privilege of working with many people and communities in my career in the Northern Territory, and what I've learnt is that people often know what they need and they know what will work in their area and in their neighbourhood to make things better. I've often been surprised at how creative and how successful they are and how bold they can be in coming up with solutions. It's true that we face many challenges in the Northern Territory, but something I've learnt from my journey to becoming the member for Johnston is that local communities are powerful when they come together and their messages can be heard and understood loud and clear. My vision for the Northern Territory is that we can find a way to bring communities together and give effect to the messages that they give us. As a member of the Northern Territory Parliament, I take the responsibility to listen to Territory communities and to do everything I can to ensure that money is spent in the way our communities are asking us to spend it. This is how we can make sure that the Territory's economic opportunities can be shared by all Territorians. Madam Speaker, there is a lot of work to do to make the Territory a more equitable place to live, and that work starts with more transparency, not less. We must move forward, Madam Speaker, not backwards. Thank you.
Member for Blaine.
I apologise to my members on this side. I will try to be brief. I just want to quickly put some comments on the record about debt and some in response to comments by the member for Johnston. Taking out a loan to pay for an asset that returns a dividend is good debt. There's a question, you know, what's an asset, what's a liability? An asset puts money in your pocket, a liability takes money out of your pocket. If you take out a loan to purchase an asset that returns a dividend to the Territory, that's a good investment, like the railway. The railway was something that the former member for Blaine, Barry Coulter, fought long and hard for, and he managed to lay the foundation for the railway in a public-private partnership so that the Territory only chipped in, I think it was about 30%, to get a fantastic asset that is still delivering for the Territory today. But what Labor did was to take out loans for ongoing regular expenses. They were paying for the day-to-day outgoings of government with borrowed money. That is the definition of borrowing to purchase a liability. The golden rule in fiscal accountability is that the private sector has to grow faster than the public sector. That is how we can be sure that the public sector will always be fiscally sound and able to provide the services that we so desperately need to pay for our hospitals, our schools, our roads, our police, our corrections, our courts. Unfortunately, what we've had over the last 8 years of Labor government is a private sector that has been choked and strangled and driven into recession, and a public sector that has grown without restraint. There's a lot of good things that happen in government. I've worked for the public sector my whole life. But there needs to be fiscal restraint, and there was none. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we need more mines, more gas, more tourism, more agriculture. We need a manufacturing sector here in the Territory, hopefully powered by gas. We need more economic development on Indigenous lands that provides opportunities for real jobs for traditional owners and Indigenous people on country, not fake jobs that are paid for by Commonwealth money coming up here and paying people to, dig a hole and fill it back in. We need real jobs with real private industry for Indigenous people on country. But the only way that we can get to a place where, Member for Johnston, the Territory is not dominated by the public sector, as you so rightly pointed out, is for us to get the private sector to grow faster than the public sector over a long period of time. And that does mean things like the Territory Coordinator, which I know we disagree about. It does mean making hard fiscal decisions, things that we would love to spend money on, but we need to prioritise our spending so that we're investing in assets, things that will return an dividend to the Territory, not liabilities that will continue to cost us money, like the shade structure on Kavanagh Street. And that's all I'll say. I won't take up any more time. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I commend this bill to the House.
Thank you, Member for Blaine. Member for Fong Lim.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I had not planned on saying anything tonight in relation to this bill because, well, in the interest of efficiency as much as anything else, but I'm compelled to say a few things. But I begin by thanking my colleague, the member for Blaine. I think what he's just contributed to the debate evidences that there are people on this side of the House thinking about economic vision, economic alternatives, economic possibilities. There is not an absence of a plan, but a contest of ideas regarding our economic futures and how to go forward. I want to particularly thank the member for Johnson for her contribution. I appreciate that she's done a lot of homework in communicating what she's communicating tonight, and in large measure I agree with many of the things that you have to say, and that is why I find it so difficult to vote for this bill tonight, because I worry that we will not restrain spending going forward. But I'm equally mindful that this is not a position that my learned colleague, the Treasurer, has asked to be put in. This is a position that we have absolutely inherited from decades of fiscal mismanagement, and particularly egregious fiscal mismanagement over the last 8 years of Labor governance. Mismanagement, overspending, I've talked about it since day one in this House and articulated what's gone wrong where and how I think it could be addressed. But I think whilst I enjoyed very much the Leader of the Opposition's remarks tonight for their comedic value in the most part, they are historically revisionist, because the fact is the books have been ground into the ground on the basis of fiscal mismanagement, gross either malice, ineptitude or negligence when it comes to our economic affairs over a long period of time. I am, as I said from my maiden speech onwards, economically rational, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, and perhaps I'm finding more fiscally conservative than some of my peers within the government. But I recognise at this point that the choice has been made by the government to not pull the handbrake fast and depress consumer demand and spook the horses, as it were. If the government were to make egregious cuts, if they were to not repeal the debt ceiling, then it's inevitable that they would hit it, that they would have to report on it, and that spending and borrowing might be curtailed and affected. And so I support my learned colleague, the Treasurer, in his effort to not spend our way out of the problem, but continue to spend in the short run to soften the landing of bringing some integrity back to our economic position. It is wholly unreasonable for us to be in the situation we're in now, where it's not half of our money that comes in revenue from the Commonwealth, it's more than 3/4 in fact. Half of it is just Commonwealth grants money, the rest of it is, half of it is GST money, the other quarter is essentially grants money in different forms. And, you know, we have to find ways, as I have said from day one, to not just spend money, but also to institutionally establish how to save it, how to stop the wastage of it, and how to make it. Now, the threads of that narrative and the plan for how to coordinate that agenda are starting to come together. And there's obviously clarity on this side of the House that improving our regulatory environment by essentially deregulating our environment quite aggressively, that's what we've done in this small space now, will hopefully facilitate private investment growth. That may or may not transpire. I certainly hope it does, because at the moment that is our singular strategy for making money in the short run, to the best of anybody's knowledge. Now, that's not the only way to run an economy, and I know that there are active conversations being had on this side in respect of all of that, but I think that we need to give the Treasurer a little bit more credit than we are giving him at the moment. They haven't spent 6 and 7 months getting across this only to come out and say, maybe we'll just keep spending and we'll spend our way out of the problem. There's more going on here than that, but I think it's important for us to call a spade, and along with some of the other discussions we're having in here where we need to be a little bit less floral and a little bit more, you know, dry about the details of the discussion, it's important to understand in sum that the fiscal position we're in is entirely the consequence of, or fundamentally or predominantly the consequence of the rapid deterioration of our debt position over the last decade, I would say. On the issue of private investment, I noted the interjection by the member for Karama, dear, in relation to the contention by the member for Johnson that we would never be able to realise private investment in this place and that it would never be able to dig us out of a financial hole. That's not true. That's not true, unfortunately. Certainly not in my opinion. It will be very difficult, but it will not be impossible. And in actual fact, it has been the common aspiration of multiple governments in the Northern Territory over decades to try and wean ourselves off the public purse by growing private sector investment and enterprise. Now, the reason that that's not happened is, well, the reasons for why that hasn't happened are innumerate, but we have to start somewhere with trying to entice and induce private investment back into this space. Because when we talk about the fact that the public and community sector is the largest contributor to the economy, that's absolutely true. But that's again indicative of the fact that we have 27,000 public servants in a place with 250,000 people and diminishing, and that is an unsustainable mix in its form in any case. So, you know, it's necessary for us to create a regulatory environment that will allow for private investment. It's necessary for us to try and reintroduce confidence into the marketplace, and that is essentially what the government is trying to do. I mean, I'm not thrilled with the nomenclature, but when the Deputy Chief Minister says "drill, baby, drill," I think what he's really doing is, in his way, saying that we are pro-sustainable resource development, that if we could just realise this, if we could go forward meaningfully, then, well, I don't think so, because I'm the one that has the conversations with him about this. And at the end of the day, both sides of this House have had a common aspiration over a very long time to try and realise resource extraction, whether in natural gas or in mining. And so it's completely useless to sling mud on either side now about not wanting to own that agenda. So at the end of the day, we have an abundance of sun, we have an abundance of gas, and it would be prudent for us to make best possible good use of both, whilst at the same time trying not to destroy our natural environment and our built environment, whilst trying to do what we all aspire to, which is to maintain territory lifestyle. I mean, the place isn't going to be worth a lick if we can't live in it anymore, and we all know that. In any case, I'm veering off topic, and I don't want to give a speech the likes of which the Leader of the Opposition did. I want to thank the member for Johnson for bringing some of the numbers into this debate. It would have been a tragedy to have this debate without some of the numbers. I want to thank the member for Blaine for bringing alternative economic vision to the debate, because it is important to understand what the difference is between vanity infrastructure spend on essentially things that are shadeless stage structures. I seldom point to that one, but it's obviously the one that we can all understand as a stranded asset and a bit of a waste of time. Enabling an essential infrastructure are what we need to concentrate our efforts on with our limited resources when it comes to trying to create multiplier effects in our economy at this stage. And again, the conversations are being had on a regular basis about where could we best realise growth, where should we put our precious dollars. Now, as I said, I hadn't intended to speak on this, and so it's not like I'm armed with facts and figures for once, but I do want to say that there is an economic vision. I think that the strategy that we've employed broadly, that the Chief Minister announced this week, provides evidence of that. And we have to be patient with a government that is less than 8 months into its tenure versus a government that was 8 years into a run of fiscal mismanagement to at least see where the cards fall and to give the government and the Treasurer in particular the benefit of the doubt in that regard. I believe we can realise private investment growth in this place. I believe that fiscal discipline will be required in order to do it. I believe our debt position is almost entirely the fault of the last Labor government, as I have said repeatedly in this place. And so while I am philosophically ill at ease with the idea of repealing a debt cap, I appreciate that, as I said, at the moment it's about creating a short-run, smooth correction with the hope of providing better fiscal management and, I hope, integrity and transparency going into the future. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Fong Lim. No further speakers. I'll call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I thank all the members this evening for their contribution to this debate. And when the opposition leader first got up and spoke about cop-outs, cover-ups and hiding, well, I thought she was talking about the Labor Party, certainly not about us. And there's been saying that the CLP has a lack of credibility in fiscal frameworks. Well, again, I thought that was pretty rich, questioning our credibility in the fiscal area. And the opposition leader said that dollars matter. And I tell you what, Mr Deputy Speaker, dollars absolutely do matter. And I don't think they really mattered to the previous Labor government because, of course, the reason we're here talking about the debt cap is because of the way that the previous Labor government were spending money. And integrity and accountability, particularly in that fiscal space, said I found it quite rich for the opposition leader to be speaking over and over about that. It just didn't make any sense, Mr Deputy Speaker. Excuse me. I just want to put the record straight on a couple of things. I did note the comments from the member for Johnson and in her contribution. And a lot of the contribution that the member for Johnson was about was the previous Labor government and what they had been doing with the finances, because now we find ourselves in the position having to deal with that mismanagement. But the one thing I need to correct is that when the member for Johnson said that the private sector investment in the territory is minuscule, you're quite incorrect on that fact. Our economy is $35 billion. That is the total economy of the Northern Territory, and our budget is only $9 billion. So it is that business and that investment from the private sector that drives our economy with that $35 billion. So I just wanted to make that point, Mr Deputy Speaker. But also that the opposition leader said that the CLP shuts down scrutiny like a whack-a-mole. We've been nothing but upfront about our budget position. And of course, I've been out with the Under-Treasurers here with us, and when we drove from Darwin down to Katherine Tennant Creek to Alice Springs to talk about the financial mess that we found ourselves in, we have been nothing but open and transparent about the budget position that the Territory is in. And I want to be clear on that too, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the future, because there's a lot of talk that we're not being transparent about the budget, that we're trying to hide things away. Nothing could be further from the truth, Mr Deputy Speaker. I will always be upfront with Territorians about our financial position. I will always be open to share those financial positions with every Territorian, and the commitment from this government is to get out there and share that position ongoing. So not only are we are in the position where we have to repeal this debt cap at the moment because of the financial position we find ourselves put in by the previous Labor government, but we'll be open and transparent with all Territorians about our fiscal position into the future. So we'll be delivering a budget in May, and then we'll be out after that budget talking to Territorians. We'll be out doing another roadshow. I hope the Under-Treasurer likes driving, because we're going to be out on the road again, and we'll be out visiting all those communities and those regional places where we can to talk about what the financial position of the Northern Territory is and what we're doing to try and deal with the issues that we've been left with by Labor, because they are legacy issues, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's going to take us, sadly, a long time to fix those legacy issues. And the one thing I note from the member for Nelson and his contribution, in the PFO from 2024, so the pre-election fiscal outlook report published before Labor lost government last year, there is a section in that on risks and contingent liabilities. And the opposition leader claimed that I've never scrutinised a budget paper. Well, I think she's quite wrong there, because I certainly scrutinised her governments over the years. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, on page 40 of this report, it says that funding for critical services like hospitals were, and I quote, budgeted to reduce or cease over the forward estimates. It's written in the pre-election fiscal outlook report. It's there in black and white, Mr Deputy Speaker, that Labor knew about this and knew that this funding was dropping off a cliff. And the leader of the opposition was a member of course, Budget Cabinet, and she knew this. If she didn't know this, then she wasn't doing her job in Budget Cabinet. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the opposition leader is correct that the former Labor government met all the reporting requirements and ticked all their boxes. However, they were actively failing to budget for the Territory's future so that their fiscal aggregates actually look better. And that is the problem we find ourselves in, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the funding that was dropping off a cliff for all these projects. They had all these projects running out into the future, but they're only funding them year by year by year to try and hide the fact that they were going to hit the debt ceiling, and they were going to hit it hard. And of course, Labor failed to act with integrity and be 100% transparent, Mr Deputy Speaker, about the Territory's true financial position, which is actually worse than we all thought. But I said I'll bring it back now to what we're actually here to talk about, and that is the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Amendment Bill. And of course, the former government, as we know, introduced that borrowing limit, which came into effect on July 2021, when there was a projection of being $30 billion in debt under that former Treasurer. And of course that triggered the Langelant report, amongst a number of other things, and that's when the debt ceiling was introduced. But as many have spoken about tonight, it seemed to greenlight the Labor government. We can spend up to $15 billion, and of course away they went. And as I said, just in the last 18 months alone, an increase in debt by $2 billion. But we have to have, a government has to have the flexibility to spend. And I don't like borrowing. I don't like spending money and throwing it after bad. I'm very, very, I suppose, tight with Territory taxpayers' money. But at the end of the day, we have to get to a point where, I think everyone's heard the term, sometimes you've got to spend a little money to make a little money. We're at a point in time now, Mr Deputy Speaker, where we have no outs when it comes to the debt cap. Labor have left us in a position where the breach of the debt cap is absolutely and utterly inevitable. The only way to stop breaching that debt cap, and I've said it publicly during the roadshow, and I've said it to the media, would be to get rid of 4,000 public servants tomorrow. That would be the only way that we could not breach that debt cap. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, that would be absolutely and utterly irresponsible. We would kill a territory if we did that, and that's something that I'm not willing to do. So we have to get to the point where we are going to need to borrow money and to deliver those services for Territorians as we work through fixing the budget. And I've been working through the infrastructure program, and the opposition leader spoke at length about that today. And I look at what Labor done to the infrastructure program commencing in about 2021-22. It went through the roof. But there was the announcements of these record spends in infrastructure. Over $4 billion, Mr Deputy Speaker, in investments into infrastructure. Sadly, Mr Deputy Speaker, they didn't have the cash to be able to do it. So the cash to be able to deliver those projects just wasn't there and is still not there. And when you look at what they had budgeted for this year, it was falling off a cliff. And they did this in such a way, Mr Speaker, so that it didn't show a breach of the debt ceiling in the outer years. So they would have published it and done it and then gone and borrowed more money to be able to do their infrastructure program, again pushing us further and further towards that debt ceiling. Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are facing fiscal challenges. Yes, these challenges, though, are created by the previous Labor government, and the opposition leader was a part of budget cabinet in that government. And to sit here and say the things that she said in debate this evening, just, as I said, is absolutely laughable. And I want to touch on one last thing before I finish up, Mr Deputy Speaker, because the opposition leader mentioned the undergrounding of the power. Now, it actually wasn't the CLP's idea to remove that. It was actually the Power and Water Corporation that came to me just after we got into government and spoke to me about that and said, Treasurer, we don't have the money to be able to do this. We said we can't do it. Not for the budget that Labor have given us, which was $65 million. And the Labor Party gaslit the people in the northern suburbs on this. Because I've actually went away and I spoke in media about this just after we had to cease that funding, and I took a bit of an educated guess on how much it would cost to actually do the underground power out in the northern suburbs. And I thought it was around $600 million plus. And I'll tell you what, Mr Deputy Speaker, I wasn't far off the mark, because I actually got Power and Water to go away and do the sums. And they've come back with a very, very conservative figure as a minimum of $500 million to do underground power in the northern suburbs. So the Labor Party were gaslighting the people of the northern suburbs, saying that they were going to underground their power for $65 million. What an absolute joke. They were only, like many of their projects, they're out on their estimates. They were only out on this one by about $450 million. And that seems to be the thing with all the projects that they tend to deliver. We've only got to look at the overpass in Tiger Brennan. Yeah, it's a huge, great piece of infrastructure, but the budgeting for that one was way off the mark as well. And it seems to be a hallmark of the previous Labor government. Make these announcements, throw a few bucks at it, but in reality, they didn't do their sums and didn't do their homework because the funds just weren't there, or they just didn't have any idea on how much it was actually going to cost. And that's why we find ourselves in this fiscal position that we're in, Mr Deputy Speaker. We're going to have to remove the debt cap. We need that flexibility to be able to spend to deliver for Territorians. But I can tell you now, Mr Speaker, that on this side of the House and the Finocchiaro CLP Labor government, we are very, very fiscally responsible, and we'll be open and transparent at all times with Territorians on territory finances. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Treasurer. The question is the bill will be now read a second time. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The Clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Act 2001.
Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I seek to leave to move to the third reading.
Is leave granted? No. We'll go to consideration in detail. Order. The Assembly will consider the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Amendment Bill 2025 Serial 15. Are there any particular clauses people wish to question? Number 2? Okay, thank you. Okay. The question is that Clause 1 stand as printed. Those of the opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The question is that Clause 2 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Treasurer, when is the legislation expected to commence?
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. The legislation should come into effect by the time it goes through the standard processes and for assent by the Administrator.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Chair. Treasurer, will you be seeking a specific date with the Administrator and the Executive Council?
At this stage, Opposition Leader, no. As I said, there are the normal processes this bill will go through, and it will go through to the Administrator for Executive Council, and once he's assented to it, it will be enabled.
Treasurer, do you anticipate that would be the month of March, the month of April, or the month of May?
I would, well, Opposition Leader, you're probably aware of this the same as I am, previously being a Minister. I would expect that this should go through to the Administrator and be dealt with probably either late March or sometime in April.
Thank you. No further questions.
No further questions. The question is that Clause 2 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Is it the wish of the Assembly that the remainder of the bill be taken together? No, sorry. Clause 5? Okay. Is it the wish of the Assembly that clauses 3 to 4 be considered together?
Oh, sorry, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Sorry?
Just double check.
No? Okay. Okay. The question is that Clause 3 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. The ayes have it. The question is that Clause 4 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My question is just to the Treasurer around, obviously, the repeal of Section 3 in Clause 4, special exemption for 2020. Treasurer, I'm confirming that through this process that there will be no attempt to prevent the Under-Treasurer from releasing a pre-election fiscal outlook before the 2028 election.
Thank you, Opposition Leader. I'm not sure if you understand what the special exemption was for in 2020. That was only put in for that 1 year because the federal government had not delivered their budget, which there was an exemption allowed for the Treasurer in the Northern Territory not to deliver a PFO for that year only. It was only ever for that year. So this is a tidying up matter to remove that from the Act. It was only ever to give the Treasurer the power not to deliver a PFO in the year of 2020.
Thank you, Minister. And so I can confirm that the Under-Treasurer will be able to release in the 2028 Northern Territory election year a pre-election fiscal outlook.
Absolutely.
Thank you. No further questions.
Okay. The question is that Clause 4 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The question is that Clause 5 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye, to the contrary no. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My question to the Minister around the Clause 5, subsection 1. Treasurer, will you ensure that Territorians will continue to have transparency over government debt levels, including the reasons of those levels, and where will they be able to secure this information?
Thank you, Opposition Leader. Well, I said Territorians will be able to get transparency and all of those figures through the various functions of Treasury, whether they be through the normal budgetary process, the mid-year financial reports, the pre-election financial reports. All those numbers will be freely available to Territorians.
Thank you. Treasurer, can you confirm where they would be able to find this information?
That would be available in budget paper number 2 and, of course, in the mid-year report.
Thank you. Further question I have, Treasurer, was will you release the Treasury advice in relation to this decision?
What decision would that be,
To
Leader of the
repeal the
Opposition?
section of the debt ceiling.
I'm trying to understand what your question is about.
My question, Mr. Treasurer, is what advice that Treasury has given you that to remove the debt ceiling is in the best interest of Territorians. Will you release that advice if that is what you received from the Treasurer's Department?
Now I understand your question, Leader of the Opposition. The decision to remove that, we did receive advice from Treasury. We received a number of pieces of advice from Treasury on different options available to the government. The decision to remove the debt ceiling was made by the Cabinet of this government.
Thank you. So just to confirm, there was no advice from Treasury to remove this section of the legislation?
Treasury provided the government with a number of options around the debt ceiling, and the government made the choice based on those pieces of advice given to us to remove the debt ceiling.
Member for Daly.
Through the Chair, Treasury, are you able to outline those options that were given to you?
No.
Speaker, my next question is, has the Treasurer sought expert economic advice outside of the government for this decision making?
The advice sought on removal of debt ceiling and around the finance of the Northern Territory were provided to us by Treasury, and I'm very, very happy with the advice that we received from Treasury. I found no need to go externally for advice.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Treasurer, what is the current forecast of debt level?
That won't be known until the finalisation of Budget Cabinet, and that will be available in the May budget.
Thank you, Treasurer. And I assume the question will also receive the same answer as previously. If Territorians are wanting to get the updated level of debt here in the Territory, they'll have to wait for the May budget papers.
Absolutely, and you should know, Leader of the Opposition, that how the process works for developing the budget. So once Budget Cabinet is completed, then the final numbers will be available in Budget Paper 2.
Thank you. Treasurer, how will you keep Territorians informed about your government's measure to reduce debt, including any budget cuts or austerity measures that you see so fit to choose to implement?
Thank you, Opposition Leader. As I said in my response and reply to our deliberations tonight, I will be open and transparent. I said we will be out there telling Territorians through various means, whether they be road shows or public events, about what's going on. And of course, there will be the opportunity to review the budget papers and of course the mid-year financial reports.
Thank you. Just to clarify around the road shows, will that expand off the Stewart Highway? Because I know the last road show was through...
Speaker.
Member for
Standing Order 155, discussion confined to the question, to the clause of the amendment being discussed. I don't know how we're back on road shows.
Look,
I'll
let the question stand and I'll let the Treasurer decide whether he answers it.
Thank you. It's up to the Treasurer to answer. He did mention in his last answer about road shows, so we just want to making sure that all Territorians have access to the information when that's put out. So the question is, will that be outside of Alice Springs, Darwin, Tennant Creek, Catherine to remote areas?
Thank you, Member for Brayton. That was quite good. Yeah, well, I do note that Labor never did a road show and never got out into the public, but I'll do my best to get out and advise all Territorians. But it will be, to be able to do these road shows, it will be budget driven.
Objection, please. Thank you, Treasurer.
Thank you,
Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. What alternative transparency measures, Treasurer, will you implement with your CLP government to replace the removal of this legislation?
As I said, there are those measures already in place, as I've mentioned, through the budget paper, the mid-year financial reports. As I said, we will endeavour to be out there discussing this with all Territorians. We've already been out twice now. We'll be doing regular public appearances where we can to discuss the state of the budget and what we're doing to repair the mess left by the previous government.
The opposition.
So can I just understand, Treasurer, there will be no, because the debt ceiling is now going to be removed once this legislation passes, that there will be no other measure to follow or to track if spending becomes more exorbitant than what was already anticipated if it was the set of the $15 billion for the debt ceiling?
Yeah, I've just been advised by the other Treasurer that all the normal parameters of the Financial Management Act will remain in force for reporting of the debt through those normal measures. So nothing is changing for the rest of that Act as far as the requirements of government to report on its finances. It is only the removal of the debt ceiling.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. So, Treasurer, can you confirm that if there is a certain amount of debt that is hit in the Northern Territory, that there will be a reporting mechanism to Parliament?
Well, that's the mid-year financial report and the budget every year, opposition leaders. So the ability to see those numbers will be available to you and to all Territorians through the normal reporting process.
So again, Treasurer, there will be no set limit on spending in the Northern Territory for the CLP's budget, and therefore no accountability for a particular figure if it is hit for the debt, as what the debt ceiling legislation was going to do, is provide a report back mechanism to Parliament, which is now being removed.
Thank you, opposition leader. I think I've answered that question as much as I can. The normal reporting processes through the Financial Management Act stay in place. So as we work through our budgets, they will be made available, and of course all accessible debt will be made available in those budgets and in the mid-year report. So I've answered that question as far as I can. I can't give you any other answer than that.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My next question for the Treasurer relates to Clause 5, subsection 1CA. Treasurer, what measures are being put in place to ensure stability and predictability in the government's spending and economic policies?
Well, if you were at our breakfast launch on Tuesday, you might have got a little bit of an idea about what we're putting in place. So, as I said, we're working through our budget process now, through our normal budget cabinet, I suppose, processes, and from that you'll see the budget in May, which will outline this government's financial priorities and what the budget looks like this year, and of course into the outer years for up to 27-28.
The opposition.
Thank you. Maybe next year you'll get that invite, we'll see. Open and transparent, but just not to the opposition. Mr Deputy Speaker, has the government assessed the long-term financial risk in removing this borrowing limit that was intended through the debt ceiling?
Yes, we have.
Is there any way to access the outcome of that assessment?
Well, that assessment will be undertaken by by Moody's. They will, once we deliver our budget, they will then look at the current state of the Northern Territory and then make their assessment on our borrowing capability post that.
And can you let us know when's the next Moody's assessment?
I don't know when that will be. It'll be sometime after the budget is released in May.
Thank you. Treasurer, what justification is there for allowing unlimited borrowing, and how does it align with the CLP's mantra to have a responsible fiscal management process?
Well, that's pretty easily summed up, opposition leader. We certainly won't be doing what the previous government was doing and continue to spend and spend and spend. We will be ensuring that, as I said, our spending and borrowing is in line with what we're able to do. We will be maintaining very, very tight fiscal measures on our budget. We'll be assessing our borrowings against our earnings, and we have a number of measures in place that we'll be using to determine how we are performing within our economy, and those measures will be certainly made public.
Thank you. So there will be an unlimited amount of borrowing the Northern Territory Government can do in the next 4 years?
We won't be having a debt ceiling. We certainly won't be going crazy borrowing money like the previous government. But as I said, we'll be doing everything within our power to ensure that our borrowings are kept to the lowest possible limit, while, of course, repairing the legacy debt issues that we seen when we came into government.
Treasurer, do you have a plan to put in any similar process of a debt cap in place for the Territory?
No.
And Treasurer, was there any public consultation in regards to Cabinet's decision or expert economic advice around the decision and the outcome of why this legislation is before the House?
Thank you, Opposition Leader. I think I answered most of this earlier on. Said the advice that we sought was from Treasury, of course. Throughout the road shows that we did down the track, plus the public concourse that we had here in Darwin, we were very, very open about the fact that we were removing the debt ceiling. It was certainly not a hidden fact. It was spoken about ad nauseum in the media. So there was, and being just a repeal of a debt ceiling, there was no requirement, in my opinion, that we needed to go out for public consultation. Our decision and our approach to this was made very, very public, and people had the opportunity to give feedback during those roadshow events in Darwin, Katherine, Tennant Creek and Alice Springs.
I think I lost my invitation in the mail for the Katherine one, Treasurer. Will you release the advice that Treasury has provided again around this part of the bill?
No.
Treasurer, how does the government plan to ensure the debt remains at a sustainable level without a statutory cap, which requires a report back to Parliament?
Well, it requires a government that's going to be fiscally responsible in our borrowings and our spendings, and that's something that I, as Treasurer, will ensure takes place.
Treasurer, will you ensure that you can have a process that requires statutory report back?
Well, we have that statutory report back through our normal processes under the Financial Management Act, which again is through the normal budget processes and the budget delivery in May and the mid-year report.
Treasurer, with the removal of the cap, is the government willing to take on significant more debt in the future without having that limit now?
Well, Opposition Leader, unfortunately, the previous government put us in a position where we're going to have to borrow more, and we're probably going to, or well, not probably, we are going to exceed the debt ceiling put in place by the Labor government. And there's virtually nothing that this government can do not to breach the debt cap that you put in place. As I said, the only way to not breach that debt cap would be to remove $400 million out of the budget immediately and ongoing. And that is something that this government cannot do and will not do because it would ruin the economy of the Northern Territory.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Treasurer, besides your goodwill, what alternative safeguards will be introduced to prevent reckless debt spending? Oh, back to Labor, thanks. We're happy about that one, Member for Barker.
That's why there has been a change of government. Now, thank you, Opposition Leader. And look, here's a few of the points around our responsible fiscal management to reduce our debt levels. Of course, we've spoken about growing our own source revenue through economic development and population growth, containing employee cost growth and restraining growth in non-frontline staffing in our public sector. We continue to engage with the Commonwealth to unlock economic opportunities and enable sustainable debt management to support regional and remote Territorians. We are strengthening policies and processes across government to improve the effectiveness of government spending and developing a new contemporary and simplified fiscal strategy focused on prudent debt management.
It all sounds good. Let's hope it's put into practice. Mr Deputy Speaker, further to my questions, what is the government's long-term strategy around debt repayment and borrowing is allowed if it is to increase beyond the $15 billion original debt ceiling?
Well, that's fairly straightforward, Opposition Leader. It's to make sure that what spending that we are doing is fiscally responsible, and of course working with the Commonwealth on our ability to increase our GST revenue, but also, as I've said, is to grow our own source revenue through various means, and that will help us work towards paying down the debt legacy that we've been left.
Treasurer, other than the normal budget process and MyEFO that is tabled in Parliament, will you be implementing any mandatory reporting around debt levels to maintain accountability to Territorians?
No, we'll be utilising the current Financial Management Act and the reporting requirements in there, which have not changed.
I think this question's probably been answered, but are there any alternative mechanisms the government is exploring when it comes to the accountability measure with the removal of the debt cap?
I think this is becoming a bit repetitive. Treasurer, if you choose to answer.
I've answered that question, Mr. Deputy.
Treasurer has answered that question. Further questions? Yep. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. So I'm just making sure I haven't missed that question. Nope, that's it. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. No further questions. The question is that Clause 5 stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. Aye. I think the aye. No. The ayes have it. Okay. This one here? Yeah. The question is that the remainder of the bill stand as printed. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The question is that the bill be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Minister, Treasurer.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill now be read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division is called. The result of the division is 17 ayes and 6 noes. The ayes have it. The bill has been passed.